one more edition of the book club. And today we have a book which is, as Runa says, 800 pages long and very dense in what it communicates. So this is a book. I mean, this is exactly the kind of book, in fact, which when we started Between the Lines, we envisioned that there would be books which maybe might be a little daunting for everybody, if that maybe not everybody's cup of tea, but they are books which everyone should know about. They'd be worth knowing. And so it is such a book that Runa has taken up today, and she's going to tell us about it. It's called First Light by Sunil Gangopadhyay, and she's reading from the English translation, which she tells me is very, very good, and to the extent that one doesn't feel that one is reading a translated work. Okay, so I think that's the best compliment you can give a translator, if the translator sort of becomes invisible, and you feel that you're reading the original text. So, Runa, over to you. Tell us about this book, First Light. Okay, Runa, over to you now.
So this is a novel by Sunil Gangopadhyay called First Light. Next slide, please. So I'll talk a bit about the author. So the author was born in 1934 and died fairly recently, about 2012. And he's a byword in Bengal. He's a really prolific writer, but he made his debut, let's say, as a poet. He was in the vanguard of modern Bengali poetry. He knew a lot of other modern poets, one being Jivananda Das, and all whose poetry even to this day is very much appreciated and all that. He was a prolific short story writer, including a lot of children's fiction. He's written a series called Kaka Babu, which are a series of mysteries with a sort of with a uncle as the detective figure, and several of these short stories have been made into movies, even fairly recently. He's a historian. He's written a lot of novels and a lot of travelogues. He's traveled quite a lot all over the world. And some of the important ones is, he's written about the partition, for instance. He himself is from Faridpur, which is erstwhile East Bengal. So he's written books about that. He's written travelogues. And he's actually a towering figure in Bengal. I've mentioned all these things here. Some of his novels have been made into films. He won the Academy Award for his novel Shei Shomoy in 1985. This book has also been translated by the same translator as Those Days. And I think a Hindi version as a TV serial has been made on this. And I'll talk a bit more about this book as background for the present book a little later. So in 2003 to 2008, he was member of the Academy, and then after that, he was made the president. The translator is Aruna Chakravarti, who is a PhD in English literature and is from Delhi. And she's really immersed in all this. She's translated a lot of these books, but one of her most interesting books is called Jora Sanko, which is basically about all the women in the Tagore family, and it's really fascinating. Next slide. Yeah.
Okay.
So I am giving here a photograph of Chaurungi, which is in the early 1900s, just to give you a flavor of the period that we're talking about, because this is a period novel. Next slide. So the background to Shei Shomoy, which is, some people consider this a sequel. They're totally independent books, but it is dealing with a period just after this, which is why I feel we need to talk about it. Can we go back, Monali, please? Yeah. So here I want to say that the period of Shei Shomoy is roughly between 17, not this one, 1700 and 1960 roughly. And this was the period which would be the start of the Bengal Renaissance. I mean, that is the overarching theme of these two books, uh, the Bengal Renaissance. So the East India Company is in control of the presidency of Bengal, and the Governor General is in charge of the presidency, which means that, the East India Company owns a lot of land here and there, but it's still not part of the British government. And the Governor General is appointed by the directors of the Company of East India, right? So this is that period. In 1858, the Government of India Act, just after the mutiny, they sort of take over. The East India Company is nationalized virtually, and they appoint the Governor General, also known as the Viceroy. So that happens in 1858 as a milestone, and I must say, till then, many of the independent princely states, large tracts of India, were controlled by independent princely states, and they automatically owed allegiance to the Mughal throne. But post the mutiny, the Mughal Empire ended, and the British government sort of replaced itself. So automatically, these princely states maintained their local independence, but they owed allegiance then straight away to the British throne, as it were. So, yeah. So the notables of that day, and the book Sheshamoy deals with these people in the background. There's Raja Ram Mohan Roy. There was Dwarkanath Tagore. Uh, I don't know why I've written Maharshi here, because he was certainly not a Maharshi. Dwarkanath Tagore was known as Prince Dwarkanath Tagore. And the story is Raja Rammohn Roy, as we all know, he came from fairly modest background, but he was educated, and he saw from the beginning things like, sati happening and all that, and he was a reformer. He worked as a clerk in the East India Company. Then he worked for the Mughals, and he was sent by the Mughals as an envoy to Britain to actually push for legislation to end sati. And the Mughals gave him the title Raja. So he did all of that. He came back, and he advocated, reform in the very rigid Brahminical traditions of Bengali society. Round about the same time, you had Dwarkanath Tagore, who was belonged to the Tagore family, and he's the one who really grew its riches. They already had lots of grants of land from various Mughals and from the Mughals, actually. They had some land, but he was an entrepreneur. He invested. He was one of the first people to start companies with the British. He was into stevedoring. He was into a lot of agencies. Eventually, he started an agency which managed all lot of zamindaris and lot of the estates of the British East India Company. The British East India Company would own a lot of these indigo plantations, jute plantations, and so on. And he went into the management of these, because the British couldn't do it all on their own. They had very few people, really. So they gave it to an agency, and these agencies managed it. So Dwarkanath Tagore owned one of these agencies. He had land. He did land management. He was everywhere. He started the first bank and the insurance companies and so on. So he grew a lot of wealth. He went to England. People in his own family, including his wife, were very against him because of his advanced social ideas. And therefore, he went ultimately to Britain, where he created a huge show. I mean, people talked about Prince Dwarkanath Tagore, and he died there, in fact. So he became a legend, as it were. Then you had Keshav Chandra Sen, who was an educationist. Then you had Devendranath Tagore, Dwarkanath's son. Devendranath was known as the Maharshi because he was also very spiritual. And he and Keshav Chandra Sen really put together and started this Brahmo Samaj. which originally actually had been started by Raja Rammohn Roy, but these two gave it new life and made it a very strong force of religious reform, because they argued for a monotheistic religion. They said, we don't have to worship many gods. There is ultimately only one God. They were all Vedantists. They went back to the old Vedanta, the Vedas, as it were, where you have this whole idea and concept of the ultimate reality of consciousness and all that sort of a thing. So a monotheistic God. So that was the Brahmo Samaj, and they also represented a lot of reform in terms of, of you see, in terms of widow remarriage, sati, abolition of sati, abolition of child marriage, and so on and so forth. Then you had a Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, who was also an educationist, a towering figure. He was behind the founding of what was originally called Hindu College, and then it was called Presidency College. And it was one of the first foundations. They founded a lot of other schools for Indian children, Bengali children. And he and there were a lot of very famous British men who were with him and helped him to do all this. There's O'Hare, and there is a lot of other people. O'Hare particularly comes to mind. So they put in the institutionalized education of English and science and all the other, let's say, modern, so-called modern kind of education in Bengal. And then you had Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay, who was a novelist, and he is primarily, I mean, he also had these ideas, and then his stories and his novels brought about the confrontation of the old and the new, and questioning things like untouchability and so on. And plus, he sort of started the modernization of the Bengali language, which was highly Sanskritized uh, up to this period. Next slide. So, okay, here, I think we can quickly skip over this. I was just giving the timelines, right? So, yeah, now we come to first slide. So, if the period of Sheshamoy is up to 1860, first light is roughly 1860 to 1920. So it's this many about about 60 decades, yeah. So this is where you see the full flowering of the Bengali Renaissance, taking off from where all the stalwarts of the previous book had taken it. Now, the themes are change in society, in literature, in religious sentiment, in human relationships, and also personal growth, how people change. And it's also a period of great political upheaval, because this is when the independence movement really starts and takes off. Congress is formed, the Indian National Congress. There are a lot of small groups, Swadeshi groups, which go in for terrorism, who actively advocate the end of the British Empire, I mean, and so on. There are a lot of other ideologies which also come in. And then you also have a cultural event, which is the growth of theater in a very formal way. I mean, in the old days, you always had these informal, troops playing in villages and all that, rather like Nautanki. But here you had theater. You had two very important theaters which came up somewhere around 1980s, 1880s or so, the National Theatre and the Star Theatre. And you had a whole troupe of really dedicated people. A lot of plays were being written from within the Tagore family itself, as well as others. And very socially relevant themes were portrayed in these plays. And this is the first time when they had women playing as women. Earlier, I mean, you didn't get any. And even now, the women uh, who became actresses were actually drawn from the red light areas of Bengal, because no decent woman ever displayed herself. And here we will find contrasts with the people in in the Tagore family, the women in the Tagore family. So, but the theater movement, the growth of the performing arts as an artistic medium, as a valid artistic medium, this is when it started. Next slide, please. Okay. So the main characters in this novel, I would put it in two groups. One are the historical characters. They play a major role. And our novelist, he sort of imagines it's all documented. The events are documented, but obviously the interactions, conversations, and all that have been imagined by the author, and therefore we will. I mean, it's a little ambiguous as to the authenticity. The events are authentic, no problem. There are legends and stories about many interactions, but he has imagined them as actually happening, which makes the book come alive, with all these people. So you had Sri Ramakrishna Paramahamsa in the background. That was another religious movement where it was mysticism. Ramakrishna himself, though he was a Hindu, he was a priest, but he actually did not believe in the separation of religion. He said all religions ultimately lead to the same one God. So you had him, you had his great disciple, Naren Datta, who later became Sri Vivekananda. You had Vivekananda's disciple, Margaret Noble, later who becomes Sister Nivedita. So these people are all actual live characters in the story. You had Girish Chandra Ghosh, who was an actor and playwright and a director. He was the man behind the Star Theatre, and he used to choose the girls from the red light area, and he trained them because they were all very unpolished, rough people, right? So he trained them into acting in fantastic roles. And one of his star performers was Binodini, who was a very famous actress. And she went on to write her, she was educated, she went on to write her autobiography, which is still there as a matter of historical record. One thing I would just like to point out, some of these people lived very short lives. Huh? I mean, okay, so there are the other historical characters who appear as characters in this novel are Jagdish Chandra Bose, who was a polymath. He was a scientist. Many branches of science. Biology is what we know, but a lot of other things, including electronics and so on, electrics. You had a doctor, very famous doctor called Dr. Mahendralal Sarkar, who tirelessly sort of fought for women to be educated and brought up as doctors. He says we can't help our women because parda was still very much observed in high society and middle society and so on. Women were not allowed to actually step out of their homes. And he says, how do we look after their health if we do not have women doctors? And he tried very much and very hard to have women accepted in medical colleges and all. He did not always succeed. That's also a fact, but this is what he advocated. Then you had Sri Aurobindo Ghosh, a very educated, anglicized person who realized that that we needed to have our freedom and our independence, and therefore he was part of a Swadeshi movement, which was not part of the Congress. It was actually part of the, more or less, I want to say it within inverted commas, the terrorist movement. Okay. Of course, eventually he became a mystic, founded his ashram and so on, but he was a key advocate of independence, an activist for independence. Then you had, these are the major characters. You had Jyotirindranath Tagore, who was Rabindranath's elder brother. I think I should mention the first picture is out here. The first picture is Jagdish Chandra Bose. Second one is Dr. Mahendralal Sarkar. The third one on the top line is Aurobindo Ghosh. Then second line, that poetic-looking man with the mustache is Jyotirindranath Tagore. He was a poet. He was a very accomplished musician on several instruments, and he was a playwright. A very, very talented figure. He wrote a lot of plays which were enacted, and he invited to his house all the top intellectuals of the day, and this had a huge impact on Rabindranath because Rabindranath spent a lot of time with him. And right at the bottom on this side, you have Satyendranath Tagore, who was Rabindranath's elder brother, Jyotirnath's elder brother, and his claim to fame is he was the first ICS officer in the civil service, the very first Indian person in the civil service. And his wife, Gyanada Nandini, was a very, very advanced looking woman. I mean, if you see her as a character in the novel, you'll find her a very prominent and very powerful character who stood up for the independence of women as persons in their own right. We must understand that till now, women were considered sort of lesser characters. So, next slide, please. Okay. At the same time, you have a second thread running through this novel, which are the fictional characters. And I'm not going to go into the detail because there are any number of events and stories, and each storyline is detailed. And I'm not going to go into those details, but it's quite fascinating when you're reading it. You have to keep track of them, but it's fascinating. So you have Bharat, who is the illegitimate son of the king of Tripura. The king of Tripura is a historical figure, and during that time, he's particularly important because he was also a poet king. He was also cruel, mind you, and he was a big lover of the arts. And very early on in Rabindranath's career, he read some of his poems and was so enamored that he sent an embassy to Rabindranath Tagore and gave him a stipend, a sort of a bursary, as it were, in recognition of his talent. So Bharat is supposed to be an illegitimate son. It's a totally fictional kind of a storyline, and it's very important because to me it appears that Bharat represents, a spectrum of society as it transformed in those 60 years. You have his tutor, Shashi Bhushan. Now, Shashi Bhushan belonged to a sort of merchant class. His family were very big jute mill owners, and they had a big house in Bhawanipur in Calcutta and all that. And this is also a fictional character, but it also shows a lifestyle, a very wealthy merchant class lifestyle, what they did, what the women did, and how they lived, and how Bharat fits into that, and then is doesn't also fit into that, and so on. And then you have a very interesting character, a woman called Bhumi Suta, who is a bondmaid of the Singhas. And now this is very, very interesting. How bondmaid? Now, she was a young girl in Orissa, and Orissa had not had so much Muslim influence. So, her father was a school teacher. He knew singing, dancing, and he taught his daughters these. He taught her how to read and write. In Bengal in those days, actually, women were not taught how to read and write. Women of good birth, so called, were not taught particularly how to read and write. So he had taught her that, but he died of cholera. There was a whole epidemic going, and he died. She was left orphaned, and she was going to be sold as a Devdasi. And that is where Shashi Bhushan was visiting at the time, and he said, "How can they do this?" So he bought her. Actually, he paid money for her and brought her to Calcutta, and put her as a sort of companion handmaid to his sisters-in-law in Bhawanipur. But the story goes on, and it's a love story sort of develops eventually between Bharat and Bhumi Suta, but they are always apart. I mean, life takes them in different directions. Then you have the story of Basanta Manjari, who is a young widow belonging to the same village as Dwarka Lal, next thing, who is again, a wealthy Zamindar's son, who is a friend of Bharat. They were all in school together. And Basant Manjari becomes one of those, child widows. And in those days, it could be, not always. I mean, many child widows found themselves landing up in the red light district. And Dwarkalal discovers her there, and he knew her when she was a child. And he sort of becomes her protector. And eventually he also wants to marry her, but she says, "No, how can you? I mean, I'm not fit to be a wife of a person like you, who's a wealthy person who's respected in society. So you have all these you have all these dynamic strains of changing relationships, because eventually he does marry her, you know, which is not only part of the widow remarriage thing, but also, she's already so-called sullied, you know, because she has been in the red light district, and so on. So then you have Dwarkalal, and then you have Jadu Gopal, who is also a friend of Bharat. These four friends are very different from each other, but they represent a spectrum of society, and the different life, different destinies that they follow. He becomes a lawyer later on and keeps in touch with them. And there is a Muslim friend of theirs whom they also had in school, called Irfan, who is again a friend of Bharat. And they show Irfan, eventually life takes him in a way where he becomes a Muslim fundamentalist, in the sense, earlier he didn't believe much in it, but I mean, he sort of fits in. He says, this is my society, this is what I am. So, he becomes a orthodox Muslim. Let's not say fundamentalist. He becomes an orthodox Muslim, lives his life, gets married, and so on and so forth. Next slide, please. Okay. So I'll give you a little about the story of Bharat, but I won't go into details. So these four boys are from different backgrounds, and their life paths reflect the social conditions shaping their respective destinies. And as I said before, it's a picture of old entrenched traditions uh, jostling with new ideologies and aspirations. Like Bharat also says, why should this be? Why does he help Bhumisuta to escape the bondmaid status? He says, we are part of the British Empire now, and there is no such thing as slavery. You consider yourself as bought for and as a slave, but you're not. You can leave this place if you want, and I can help you. I can take you to a refuge which has been opened by the Brahmo Samaj for educating people like you, and then maybe you can find a life. You can make a life for yourself. And in fact, he actually does that, but they get separated, and uh, she escapes, and she finds herself into going into theater. She becomes again a fictional actress, very famous, very accomplished, and so on. Lot of religious beliefs are challenged. Lot of old orthodoxies are challenged by these people. And at the same time, you also see them, talking of scientific discoveries which have been made recently, and we need to change. We need to bring about a change in the society. Okay, next slide, please. So I'm giving you a view of the life as it was, because there are four concentric circles, and they all mix and match in the society. So I start off with, first of all, the Tagores of Jorasanko and the Maharaja of Tripura, historical characters. The first picture with the red building, that is Jorasanko. That is the family house of the Tagores in Calcutta. And on the right is their compound inside Jorasanko. Acha. Then you have the Brahmo Samaj, Vivekananda, Sister Nivedita, Ramakrishna Mission. So all of these people are affected by these four, strands, let's say, which is the spiritual and religious section. Then, on the other hand, that green circle there is Girish Ghosh, National Theatre, Star Theatre, Binodini, and Jyotirindranath, who was also associated with it. And the white building at the bottom is the Star Theatre. It still exists today. Then again, you have on the pink circle is Jagdish Bose, Mahendralal Sarkar. They are the scientifics, and a lot. I mean, you have a lot about how they discovered this and what their theories were about science and the new world and so on. Then you have in the blue circle, you have Bharat, Dwarka Lahiri, Jadugopal, Irfan, Bhumisuta, Basanta Manjari. These are the fictional characters, and their stories sort of ties things together and maintains the interest in the whole novel, as it were. And on the side, you have Aurobindo Ghosh, Hemendra Kanungo, and Tilak and Gandhi. They all make little guest appearances, as part of the independence movement. Okay, next slide. Right. Now I come to Rabindranath Tagore, because he is the key figure in this book. In fact, if you leave the fictional side out, he is the hero of the story, and this covers his youth from around about roughly the age of 20 to about 50. So 50 to 60 actually. So it covers that period. And if you see this first photograph is him at around age 20, when he had just come back from England. He was sent by his father, that Rabindranath Tagore, to stay in England and study law. He went to school, he studied, he got into law, but he didn't like it. And his elder brother Satyendranath was staying in England at that time with his wife and family, and he stayed with them. So he spent time in England to study law, but he didn't like it. He came back home. And at that time, his brother Jyotirindranath had already been married to a very accomplished lady, very sensitive and poetic lady called Kadambari. And they had a house in Chandanagar where they spent many months. And Rabindranath also spent a lot of time. Jyotirindranath was busy with his music and meeting people, creating drama, doing playwrights. So very often, sister-in-law, brother-in-law were thrown together, and he was writing. He was writing a lot of poetry at that time, and his he used to sound them off with Kadambari, and Kadambari had great taste, and great feeling. So she wouldn't hesitate to criticize him also, saying, "I don't think this is okay. I think here you're just being, uh, you know, too simple or too affected or whatever it is." And he used to feel very irritated at that and say, "How does a woman know?" That kind of a thing. But he did go by a lot of her strictures, because she had a very instinctual feel about these things. This is a relationship has which has been controversial and ambiguous, and it's one of those myths. A lot of people say, "Oh, it was a love story, it was a this, it was a that," but frankly we don't know. Nobody knows. And uh, 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 the novelist himself, deals with the whole thing very sensitively, without committing either way. um, it is through their society. And then when they came and lived in Calcutta and all that, they set up their own sort of apartments and house. They wanted Rabindranath to spend a lot of time with them. He was then involved a lot with the Brahmo Samaj. He used to write a poem a day virtually, for their functions. And in their society, he was exposed to the top intellectuals and literateurs of the day. So, he never had any formal education, but he had the occasion to meet the top scientists, intellectuals, artists of the time, as well as his father was a towering figure in terms of philosophy. His elder brother Dwijendranath was also a philosopher. So he was exposed to, let's say, the highest thought, as it were. So that was his education. Next slide. Okay. So the, the boys were all married relatively young, and as per normal custom, he was married off to a girl called Mrinalini Devi in 1883. She was 10 years old and he was 22. And very common. There is a snippet, the Tagores, despite their wealth, their culture, and status, usually found it a little difficult to find women to marry into their household because of very old uh, casteist prejudices. I won't go into the details. They were Brahmins, but by many people, they were not considered pure Brahmins. So, anyway, what I'm trying to say is his wife came from a very poor background, respectable, but, yeoman stock from the country. And what I would like to highlight here is, though she was educated here in this family, and she was exposed to everything that this family represented, she never really exactly gelled. She liked cooking, she liked running the household, she liked managing children, and she was not intellectual at all. She was an ideal mother, She was an ideal household manager. She was an ideal, the traditional role of wife she fulfilled beautifully, but she wasn't an intellectual. So I would like to point out that as far as Rabindranath was concerned, he had to look for this kind of input from elsewhere. So next year, the year after, 1884, Kadambari died by suicide. Nobody really knows how, why, what, which. I mean, there's a lot of stories on this as well. Uh, Going by this book and the little facts that we know, she didn't have children. Very unusual, and a lot of people would hold this against her. You know, how come you don't have a baby as yet, and so on. Maybe that was one thing she felt. She, I think, was a little depressive. So, whatever it is, in 1884, she died by suicide, and her death affected Rabindranath a lot. He was really, really grieved. And it was as if, sort of one of the closest people he was intellectually, he had lost. Okay. Then the other brothers, all involved in their own lives, Tagore's father, Debendranath, uh, co opted Rabindranath to manage the family estates, which were vast. Okay. And that's what he did for the rest of his life. In fact, he was the manager of their entire estates and their entire money and everything. He's the one who managed the treasury, everything. But from 1890 onwards, he went with his wife to the family house at Shilaidaha, which is actually falls in East Bengal. And then he would go around by barge, and the barge I'm showing here, this is the family barge at the bottom. And that red building is the family house at Shilaidaha. And this is his wife and Tagore when they got married. This is the marriage picture. He would travel by barge to all their states. He would visit each village. He would collect whatever taxes or dues, and he would also be the magistrate. Because then the villagers would wait for him to come with all their little problems, and they would put it before him so that he can give a sort of judgment. So he used to spend his entire days doing this, come back, bathe, eat, and then that is when he would write. I mean, his body of work is enormous. We have no idea how much I mean, we do have an idea. He wrote an enormous amount, can't encompass it. And I used to always wonder, when did he manage to do this if he's busy managing the estates and going this? But he was very conscientious in his duties as as a zamindar. He wasn't an absentee type at all, and he also had empathy for his people. He observed the separation of castes, untouchability, religion, and he didn't like it. He says, why can't we all be together? So these were the things which he tried. But again, uh, he wasn't an activist, so he couldn't force things. And I think he was wise enough to realize that you can't force change on society. It has to happen slowly. Okay, so more milestones. So up to 1905, very productive. He wrote all his poems, wrote many of his poems. He wrote plays, he wrote essays, and treatises on a lot of issues. And so I will just cover the milestones. 1901, he moved with his family to Shantiniketan. He realized, he says, he was also an educationist. He had ideas about education. And he hated this structured education by rote, where you have fixed things. He believed, I think we are all familiar with his beliefs of, being open and you know, giving children the atmosphere and the input as required by them and as able as being as they could absorb it, as and when they could absorb it. So he moved to Shantiniketan, which was also part of his family estates. His father had already started an ashram there. I mean, there was a meditation hall which has been made. He had started it there. So he moved there and he started his school. The painting at the side, that panel, that's a mural by Nandalal Bose. He decorated many of his buildings Nandalal Bose decorated many of the buildings with these murals and so on. The lady on the top is Mrinalini at a relatively mature age. Mature meaning what? She died in her 30s. So this is her when she's older. And the house at the bottom, that yellow house, is the house which was built and in which they lived. So this experimental school of his later becomes Vishwa Bharati, which is existing to this day, and which has in fact produced a whole lot of stellar people in our modern day. I mean, a lot of artists. Amitabh, who was that Nobel laureate economist? Um, um,
Amartya Sen.
Amarnath,
Amartya Sen.
Amartya
Amartya Sen.
Amartya
Sen.
Sen. Amartya
Amartya
Sen.
Sen.
Amartya Sen studied
Amartya
there
Sen.
for Amartya Sen studied there for a few years, and many of them. I mean, I can't enumerate. It will be too long a list. So Vishwa Bharati still exists to this day. In 1902, Mrinalini dies, and they have 5 children by that time, and 2 of his younger children also die. I mean, nobody knows, but some illness. So and Rabindranath, he feels it. He feels it very badly. I mean, all these losses, and I suppose it also informs his poetry, because there isn't a moment, there isn't a feeling, there isn't a nuance in mood which he has not captured in his poetry. You know, so in 19 acha, meanwhile he travels abroad also, and in 1912 he has a selection of poetry which he translates himself, which is the Gitanjali. And he's traveled to Europe at that time. He meets YB Yeats, he meets some of these other people, and they are so impressed that they push for his nomination for the Nobel Prize. And he ultimately does get the Nobel Prize in 1913. Uh, and and because of that, he suddenly gets huge status. And in 1915, the British government recognize his worth, and they give him a knighthood. But after the Jallianwala Bagh massacre in 1919, he immediately renounces the title, and he's written a beautiful poem at that moment, saying that I just can't accept these things. I mean, I want to stand with my people, and great injustice has been done. Whatever, but it's a beautiful poem. Um, so he does that. Now, I'm not going to go beyond, because the next 20 years of his life is also very full. He travels the world. I mean, there is no South America, Bali, Java, Indonesia, Japan, uh, all over the place. He travels the world, and because of his status, oh, finished. So good. So I mean, I'm giving you a nutshell uh, of the life and times of Rabindranath Tagore from age 20 to age 60. And it's a book which, if you read it, it left me altered, in my thinking, in my it changed me, I would say. It contributed to my evolution, just simply by the knowledge of all the people and what they did, how they lived, what they fought for, what they thought. And it's an enormous book, but and very varied in everything that it's dealing with. The scope of the canvas is enormous, but it leaves you sort of changed, and it leaves you with a better understanding of where we have come from. I mean, what we take for granted today didn't come easily. It's on the backs of all this work which has happened before. So that was my takeaway, and that's why I wanted to present it, just because it's not very well known outside Bengal, really. So that's why I wanted to present it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Runa. That was very informative. You're right when you say that it's not known beyond Bengal, because I didn't know of it. Um, and of course, we're all aware that the Tagore family contributed so much to, I mean, they made the Renaissance of Bengal happen. So we talk of Bengal before the Tagores and Bengal after the Tagores. So clearly their contribution is enormous. And I dare say this novel will actually fill in lots of actualities so that you know exactly what they did. And that relationship with the sister-in-law is another very famous thing and always spoken of in very ambiguous terms. So I suppose we should just let it lie there because there's nothing else we can do, not having facts. But obviously, human curiosity is such that one would really like to know, this quite a delicious relationship that one might want to
Can
explore.
I uh, can I
Yeah.
just butt in here about relation? Tagore, a lot of people put it this way that Kadambari was his muse, and certainly she
Yes.
fulfilled that role.
Yes.
But this was not the only one. Throughout his life, there were a lot of ladies, and I
Mm.
think because he was such an ultra empathetic and sensitive man that women vibed with that a lot,
No, and
and they vibed with that a lot, and therefore I don't know, in this situation I feel you can have uh, you can have very deep relationships, very emotionally significant relationships without it being sexual.
Yes,
ah,
yes, yes.
yeah, true, true.
Yeah. Can I say something to that? I mean,
Please,
uh,
please.
uh,
Alka, yes.
sorry,
Can you
definitely,
unmute? Yeah.
yeah, yeah, definitely. Kadambari was his muse, but I think what Runa is saying, that he had these relationships with different women. That is also because I think the kind of intellectual he was, different women satisfied different things in his life. His wife Mrinalini uh, was not an intellectual, so she could not understand anything else. Like, in fact, in the book he says that he read a poem to her and she fell asleep, or she started yawning, because she didn't understand, she didn't get it. So Kadambari was his muse, but I think his niece Indira, who's also mentioned, she's the one who with whom he has a very intellectual, a stimulating relationship. So I mean, I firmly believe there's nothing sexual in this. I don't think he was, because his wife was there. I think sexually he was pretty satisfied. So I don't think that was the issue at all. It was his mental and intellectual cravings that he was satisfying outside.
Yeah.
Yes, Kaveri.
Yeah, I found it also an extremely interesting book. As Runa says, it covers such a wide canvas, and it demonstrates it was a kind of a period of extraordinary, for Bengal at least, it was a period of extraordinary coming together of a great kind of intellectual outpouring and social reform, great cultural efflorescence. So it was a very interesting period that is talked about. And during the course of this, one thing that I found, Runa, perhaps you could tell me your impression, the depiction of Nivedita and Swami Vivekananda, that was also very interesting. And I felt I had a little bit of difference in the way in which he showed Sister Nivedita as almost like a lovesick schoolgirl, kind of, in the way in which she was reacting to Vivekananda. I don't know what your impression is of
So,
that,
so
but
this is something, isn't it, in history? I mean, we Bengalis are always aware
yeah,
that Vivekananda attracted any number of women,
yeah,
and especially in the West, they
yeah,
all fell for him hook, line, and sinker. And it was like a mixture of fan worship, idol worship, infatuation, whatever you like to call it. And I think Sister Nivedita was definitely I mean, she was infatuated at that level, let's put it that
yeah,
way, huh? And it brought her all the way here, and what sacrifices she made. And
amazing, yeah,
she considered herself an Indian, a Hindu, you know So it brought her all the way there. But what I'm, that infatuation, as you say, uh, there are a lot of small snippet stories of Vivekananda's, visit to Chicago, and that lecture he gave in this thing of religions, Parliament of Religions,
Yeah.
and how everybody, all these American women, they made it possible. They contributed. They put him here, put him there. He went penniless,
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they did it. So he obviously had great charisma. So there's
Yeah.
no doubt about that.
Yeah.
But even
No,
even in
but
the book,
yeah.
Nivedita actually mentions
Mm,
that she wants to have a man-woman relationship with Vivekananda. She says that. She
mm.
says that I want to do that. Vivekananda says no, because he's anyway he's a sannyasi, so he can't
He
Yeah.
no,
do
he
that.
didn't
Yes.
look at it like that at all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Vivekananda, you know, he had charisma. But again, there's another point of view. If you read the religious history of that time, I mean, all about Ramakrishna and all that, the feeling in that, not just community, but in that literature, the feeling you get is that, the charisma which Vivekananda had, it was God given. It was something which was he was born for a specific purpose. He lived only 39 years. Can you imagine?
Yeah, he died young.
He died young. Yeah. Yeah.
And
He
he
died
died
young.
very young. And within that time, everybody knew about Ramakrishna. Everybody knew about Vedanta. I mean, he is the mode by which Vedanta got introduced to the West. That is
Mm.
started, and then after that, it was Yogananda, Sri
Yeah.
Paramahansa.
Yeah.
He's the one who went, and then he set up missions there. So they all went for a purpose. And Vivekananda was this, and he founded the Ramakrishna Mission, which is huge today and is doing very sterling work, you have to admit. So,
Mm.
but he was only 39 years old. And Nivedita also was not very old. She also died a few years later, but
Yeah.
they left their stamp on history.
So, I'm from the Brahmo Samaj, by the way, and
You are.
I have also happen to be from Jagadish Bose's family. So
Wow.
Nivedita was also very close with Jagadish Bose,
Mm.
and she was also a person who had very great uh, what will I call it? She could be very obdurate, very stubborn, very opinionated. That's not a side of her that you see over here.
Yeah.
Mm.
And so that was a different perspective that I got of her. In fact, she died in 1911 when she was with Jagadish Bose and Abdullah Bose in Darjeeling.
Mm.
They had taken her there to take care of her. And she died. Yeah, she died very young.
She also died very young.
So it was a very interesting book, and the way in which he talked about the theatre movement in Bengal. That was also, and he brought in Gandhiji. And by the way, Sharala Ghoshal, who's mentioned in this book, who becomes Sharala Devi Chaudhurani, was, that Gandhi and Gandhiji, Gandhiji was ready to declare her as his spiritual wife. And fortunately, he had a very close relationship with her. And she was in the Punjab then, and in the midst of the entire national movement.
Yeah.
And he stepped back in time, and that was a major sort of upheaval which was going to come about. But fortunately, it was stopped.
Was.
So
And
that is a Tagore's niece, his aunt, his sister Sharna Kumari's daughter. Sharala Ghoshal.
Who was the novelist. And here again, I'd like to mention here, as he grew older, and it's outside the scope of this book, but which I always found interesting. Rabindranath and Gandhi they were correspondents. They used to write letters to each other.
Yeah.
They met, of course, but they were. And though both of them were very dedicated to the idea of independence and all that, but their ideologies were very different.
Right.
And there is a series of letters, and it's been made into a play, which I have been trying so hard to get to Pune, because I'm sure in Pune people will appreciate this. It's based solely on the letters exchanged between them, and it's called the Mahatma and the Poet. And
Mm.
it's a fabulous play, and it's been staged all over the world actually. And I don't know, I must try to get it staged
Yes,
here.
indeed. You
It would
must.
be very
Yeah.
interesting, I should think.
Okay.
Yeah.
I have a question, Runa, if I may. for me.
Yes, yes.
I wanted to ask if Rabindranath Tagore has not written anything in English at all. He wrote only in Bangla.
He wrote mostly. No. He has
Yes.
some letters are in English. His letters to Gandhi are in English.
Okay, but no stories, poems, none of
Stories,
his.
his
no, he
Well,
literature,
he translated the Gitanjali into English
Gitanjali
himself.
himself.
yeah,
And
but first he wrote it in
admit,
Bengali.
despite being a Bengali, that was some of the translation is pretty poor. He
Yes,
acknowledged himself that he was not a good, his command over English was not
Yes.
very good.
not very
But he translated into English himself. Yeah.
No,
The
you know,
Gitanjali.
the
Yes,
letters from Europe, and all of that is in Bengali only, na, Kaveri?
To the
No.
I don't know. To various people, there's a collection letters from Europe. Monali knows something?
you'll be
Monali
next.
wants
Okay?
to say something.
Yes, ma'am, may I say something?
Yes, go ahead.
Tagore was impeccably very good with not just English, but also German.
Yeah,
He read
that's what.
philosophers, these German transcendentalists, all in German. And his English was so good that he actually wrote a primer for English. He also wrote a primer for Sanskrit. He also wrote a primer for Bengali. Because I had these books at home, I know about these. He also
Monali, I have a
translated many of
different
his.
view
He's a
on
poor
that.
translator.
His knowledge of English was not good at all. His
Oh,
he knew English, but he could not express. His if you read the Bengali Gitanjali, it's exquisite,
So
and
was a
he
poor translator.
really damages it when he
Yes, I agree with you there.
translates
But
it
he
into
was a
English.
poor
But yes,
translator.
of course, he was very fluent in English.
But I think his prose was probably better.
Yeah.
Ma'am, all his lectures have been written in English. They have been
Yeah. He
delivered
was
in
very
English,
fluent.
and
He
he
was very
has
fluent.
written in English. He has translated many of his own stories into English. He's also translated many of his poems into English.
Monali,
So
he is on
I'm not very
record.
sure about how.
He is on record as having said himself that I know that my fluency in English is very limited. He is on record as having said it himself. He was, of course, he could speak perfectly. But I'm
Yeah,
just
but
saying,
then
his
Spent
literary
a couple of years
genius
in
was
England.
compromised. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
So
I
probably he
tried
was
to-
being
I tried to
humble.
read the Gitanjali, wasn't very impressed by it.
No, the
And
English is
I
not.
felt very bad about it, thinking, oh my
Right.
God,
Right.
this is Tagore and this is
absolutely.
Gitanjali, Nobel
No.
Prize, and I
No.
don't like it. Oh my God.
No.
So yes,
Because
this does help a
you're
bit.
right.
So-
But the
has
Bengali is
anybody
beautiful.
else-
The Bengali is beautiful. It just
So has anybody else tried to translate Gitanjali into English?
I
From-
did because I had to teach that to my students,
Oh.
and because I
Okay.
can read both languages all right, it
Okay.
was possible for me to. Yes, I do agree that some of the translations are not great, but the translator was not Tagore himself. At least for the version that I was using, the version that I was using was published by Macmillan
Okay.
in 1964. So, and this was not a very great translation.
Mhm.
It was translated by some English author,
Mhm.
but the translation wasn't great. But what I did was, because I could see that there's a gap between the Bengali and the English versions, I gave them I would recite the original Bengali for them. And even if I did not translate it for the students, it was possible for the students to bring out meanings, because many of those Bengali words are familiar to them, because we all belong to India. So that is how Gitanjali went across to our students very well. In fact, they were hungering even for the songs, the musical renderings of the poems. So we had only 10 or 15 poems in the syllabus, but then we ultimately ended up reading all the 100
Oh
poems.
my, how
So,
lovely.
Wow, how
very
lovely is
beautiful.
that?
Yeah.
So I'd just like to thank
Thank you.
Runa for a wonderful presentation. I know the book is humongous, and for her to, concise it into such a lovely presentation, hats off. And she managed to touch almost all aspects of the book. And for those of you who haven't read this book, please go ahead and read it. And once it won't be enough, you'll have to go back, because there are so many characters in the book, and the author has fleshed out each character so beautifully. And the wonderful thing is that he has presented history in a colorful package. So there are some real life characters and there are fictional characters. So when I started the book, I was, I kept worrying, is this fiction? Is this really true? And then I said, forget it, just enjoy the book. Who cares whether this portion is fiction or that portion is, real? It's really a beautiful book.
Did you
So
read it twice? You're the one who read it twice.
yeah. I've read Those Days also twice.
Okay.
Yeah, this is what I was trying to say, Runa. The same thing
Yes.
what that
Yes,
she
yes.
said.
Yeah.
Set against the background of 1857 and
Right.
post 1857.
Yes,
Very
yes.
similar to,
Yeah.
So that's
Okay.
the prequel.
So Those Days is another novel by him.
It's another
Yes.
novel.
Yes.
Another novel. It's the first. It's a prequel, sort of.
Yeah.
It
I see.
shows the period of really hidebound Bengali society.
yes.
The Brahminical traditions, how women were treated, what they take. And then you have this, which is, trying to change all of that. So,
Okay.
It
Yeah,
really
so
sort of opens your eyes to, what happened in Bengal during the Bengal Renaissance, and a lot of things that we normally would not be aware of if we
Yeah.
hadn't read those two books. So
right,
this,
I get
this
it.
is a sort of microcosm for the whole of India, because what happened at that time in Bengal actually then got replicated at different times and different
True.
pace throughout India, isn't it?
Yes.
Prashant, I'm wondering if you would like to join the conversation. Arpita, are you there? Would you like to comment on your mom-in-law's presentation?
Yeah,
Oh, okay.
but yeah, it was definitely interesting having read Shei Shomai, which is Those Days. Definitely urges me to rediscover and begin to read this book to see how it evolved from the times of Shei Shomai. Um, culturally, where did we go, and what was the intellectual movement that brought about the Bengal Renaissance, so to speak.
Yeah,
Yeah.
wonderful presentation. Very good. Very well presented by Runa. Such a wide canvas, and how beautifully she depicted it through those slides that she showed. Very well.
Yes, exactly.
It's the only way to give you a taste, because this is not even 1/5 of the whole thing, right, Shakun? Impossible.
Yeah. It's so you've done it very well. I mean,
Yes.
it's really huge, and
Yeah.
to concise it, to make a précis of it, it's really difficult.
Correct.
And that I must say, I mean, you really did that, You gave it to us
True.
sort of in bullet points and important things that happened. The
Yes.
historical figures, of course, are known to us.
One more thing, if I may.
Yes.
So when we were doing the book, when Runa was in Delhi, she had only suggested doing the book. And I'd finished the book and I was making a trip to Calcutta. And she told me that you must visit Zora Sanko.
Zora
And then I took a friend along who's a Bengali and she's a Calcuttan. And she hadn't gone. So the two of us went. My God, I can't tell you. It was as if the book had come alive. The house is just as it is described in the book.
Yeah.
So that was
Yes.
wonderful. And thanks to Runa again for that.
My Zoom was taking me somewhere else.
Okay.
Mohini, you're mute.
You're muted.
Runa, Aruna Jetwani just called. She said she can't seem to get through on her device, but she wants to congratulate you on your excellent presentation. Right, Aruna?
Wow.
Did I get it right?
I'm more interested in it because Sadhu Vashwani was also in initial stages. Brahmo Samajist, Sadhu Viranand was a Brahmo Samajist. Sri Ramakrishna Paramhans is also. And Vivekanand, Nivedita, I know all the stories.
Okay, thank you.
Their ashram in Chicago some years ago. Yes. And of course, because of various Sindhi leaders being connected with that area for the last 200 years, you can say. I really was interested in the background to the history, and I know also about Rabindranath Tagore and his sister-in-law and the stories that have gone around and things like that. So I was really very, very impressed.
Okay, thank you. So I think she was able to hear all of this.
Yes.
Thank
Yes.
you, Aruna. Thank you. Okay. So there are compliments all round, Runa.
Mhm.
Everyone who has commented has enjoyed the presentation, has been enriched by it, has learned something more than they knew before. So all in all, all boxes have been ticked. Everything has gone well. Thank you so much.
Yes. So
Thank you, Mohini, for
I
being a
apologize.
wonderful moderator. Thank you.
Oh,
No,
thank you.
And
your
I
introduction and summing up is excellent. Thank
And I thank everyone, for being here, for participating, for stimulating each other, because that's what the discussion does. One person makes a comment, triggers off something in somebody else, that person comments, and so on and so forth. Now, buddy, bye-bye.